Fun Ideas Productions presents the Fun Ideas Podcast.
Hi, this is Mark Arnold, and welcome to Fun Ideas Podcast number 17, and welcome to 2019. I'm still doing work on my Total Television scrapbook. I finally transcribed my Harvey Siegel interview from 2014, and I'm waiting for an approval by him. And I'm starting to do the final image selection for the book. I have to follow up with Victoria Biggers to see where she's at as well. Today's guest is Troy Howarth. He is a huge movie buff and fan of directors such as Scorsese, Polanski, Herzog, Carpenter, Argento, Bava, Fellini, and others. He has written a number of books about various Italian horror movie directors, and we will be discussing these books and his other interests. Here he is, Troy Howarth. All right, I have Troy Howarth on the line. How are you today?
Oh, very good. How about you?
Fine. How are you? I always say that, and then I've already asked you. Silly me. Anyway, let's see. You are a self-proclaimed huge movie buff. And I'm reading this off of my script here. Actually, you were recommended to me, but I knew about you anyway, from Phil Hall, who was a recent podcast guest. And you seem to have a huge affinity for like Italian horror films, among other things. How did you get interested in that genre, or just in film history in general?
Well, when it comes to just movies in general, I suppose I don't really have that sort of seminal moment where I can say that's what made me into a movie buff, because I've always been tremendously interested in movies, just going back to when I was a child, especially horror films, although when I got into my teenage years, I started to realize that there were other things out there, so started to expand beyond that. But growing up as a kid in the 80s, my dad put it well one time. He said, "You're probably the only kid at school who knows that Mae Clarke played the female lead in Frankenstein." That's probably true, and certainly while everybody else was idolizing during that time people like Schwarzenegger and Stallone, here I was, thinking that Basil Rathbone and Christopher Lee and Vincent Price were as cool as it got. So I guess I was a little bit of a fish out of water in that sense. But with the Italian stuff, again, just growing up in the 80s, there were these wonderful sort of late night horror film sort of programs that would come on, just regional shows that I can remember watching, things like Haunted Hollywood and Chiller Theater with Chili Billy Cardilli, and Suspense Theater and Shock Theater and things like these. Are regional versions of those programs, and every now and again you would get some weird offbeat movie that showed up that clearly wasn't quite what I was accustomed to. I was too young to understand the whole concept of like dubbing and things like that, so I could just tell something from the soundtracks and things. These movies were a little bit weird, and I remember the one that really made a huge impression on me when I was very young was Baron Blood, which is a Mario Bava film, and there was just something about that movie that stood out and really impressed me, and as I started to investigate more, is seriously into horror movies and trying to get a sense of who the big players were and things like that, I discovered that it was directed by a man named Mario Bava, and that apparently he'd done a lot of movies like that. So that intrigued me, and just started digging around from there.
So that was your first exposure to Mario's films? It wasn't Black Sabbath or anything like that?
No, it was Baron Blood, which is really kind of a minor Bava film, although it is a good sort of intro movie in a way, because it gives you a sense of his extraordinary visual talent and his ability to redeem a kind of shoddy script with just sheer atmospherics. And it helped, too, probably seeing that one, because it was uncommonly well dubbed. Alfredo Leone, who produced that film, was insistent that the movie should be shot in English. And he had English-speaking actors in it like Joseph Cotton and Elkie Summer, and they actually dubbed their own roles. So it didn't have that alienating quality that you get with some of the other ones. I remember seeing The Whip and the Body for the first time, for example, on I think it was Commander USA's Groovy Movies, and watching it and thinking, Christopher Lee doesn't sound right. Well, of course, it's not his voice, so that's a slightly different kind of experience.
Hi, I'm Christopher Lee. No, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, not quite the same.
Now, you said you named some of the shows that you were seeing some of these films for the first time. That was local to you. You're in Philadelphia, is that correct? Or
no, Johnstown, PA, which is referenced in George Romero's Dawn of the Dead. If you remember, at one point they're flying overhead, and I think it's Peter says, "Oh, those rednecks down there are probably enjoying this." That's Johnstown.
So how far are you? I know where Pennsylvania is, but I think I've been to the state once. I've been more over into New York. So geography lesson, please.
Boy, you've asked a lousy person geography lesson.
Well, I mean, okay, let's make it easy. West or east of Pennsylvania?
I'm a couple of hours outside of Pittsburgh, for example. So. Okay. Western PA.
Okay, got it. Okay, so I've definitely not been out there because I've been like on the eastern side. So, did they tend to? Well, I'll give you background on me. So I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the big show there was Creature Features, which originally had Bob Wilkins and then later John Stanley, and they tended back in the 70s and 80s to show the movies as uncut as possible. I think they might have made a couple minor cuts to Night of the Living Dead for excessive gore, but in general, if they had nudity or other types of bloodshed, it was shown. So was that the same case here? So did you see a lot of these Bava films uncut?
No.
Okay.
Unfortunately, even something like Barren Blood, which is fairly mild, I remember it had big sequences cut from it, which I didn't catch up with until I saw it on the HBO Thorny MI VHS later on. Even that version was cut from the European one, but no, they tended any kind of nudity. Anytime things got even remotely sexy, very often things were cut out. It's kind of surprising in hindsight that they cut movies as badly as they did.
Yeah. Well, I know one time Bob Wilkins on Creature Features, this wasn't for time, it was just a bad print. They were going to show House of the Seven Corpses or some title like that, if I believe. And he said, we can't show that film because they cut two out.
They cut two of the corpses out.
I don't know if that was a joke or not, but it was basically, that the print that they received at the channel, as KTVU Channel 2 in San Francisco, was so bad that they ended up filling time with having guest appearances by, Chinese New Year's Dragon and other things, because this is a live show. They didn't have anything to show. And so they showed little short films and other things in its place, and they managed to get through the show. But they did show you're familiar, I'm sure, Twins of Evil, the Hammer film. Yeah, they showed that uncut, bare breasts and everything. But that was in the loosey-goosey pre-Fox television days because they became a Fox affiliate and things like that.
Well, even recently, there's a channel we have around here. It's a retro channel called MeTV, and I think it was MeTV anyway, but they were running the Vincent Price movies Theater of Blood, which is a movie I'm very fond of. And, of course, if you know that film, it's all about Vincent Price playing an actor who's getting revenge on the critics by killing them. And, I mean, this is one of those movies I've seen so many times I've virtually memorized. So I'm watching it and gets through the opening titles, and I come to realization they cut the first murder scene out of it, which I couldn't believe. And, this is just within the last year or two, and it's not like that movie is that violent or whatever. For whatever reason, the print that they got a hold of had that entire very important first sequence cut.
Wow.
That's very strange.
So prior to this Bava film, I'll get into Bava again because I know that's your first book, but what was your favorite studio? Was it the Universal stuff, the AIP stuff, or the Hammer stuff?
Well, again, bearing in mind I was probably watching a lot of this stuff way sooner than I probably should have been.
Me too.
I'll give you an example. My maternal grandmother passed away when I was about 2 years old, and even she made a comment about me liking these movies.
Oh, I didn't go that far back.
I must have done, because she used to say that my mom, screwed me up from birth by watching things like The Omen when she was pregnant with me. So that's, of course, the perfect movie. And Rosemary's Baby, those are perfect movies to watch when you're pregnant. So I was aware of Hammer and Universal from very, very young age. AIP I wasn't as aware of until later on. Hammer, for me, when I was very young, was a little too intense. Of those movies, I can remember watching Dracula, Prince of Darkness, for example. My mom had recorded it off of Chiller Theater for me, and, because it used to run late, and I was just, however young. I was younger than 5 years old at the time. And so I sit down to watch it, and it was scaring me. And I think, but in the space of like the opening 20 minutes, I asked her to turn it off like 3 times until she finally said, "I'm putting it back on. If you have me turn it off again, I'm not putting it back on." So I toughed it out for the rest of the movie. So when I was very, very young, Universal was my go-to, because those movies, they enthralled me, but they didn't really necessarily scare me too much. The Hammer films, when I was very young, did scare me, but I became huge fan of those later on.
Right. Okay. That's about similar to what I did. Then, so going to your book, so your first book was called, what is it here? You could say it, The Haunted World of Mario Bava. Now,
yes.
you published that twice, correct? Is that the...
Well, the first time I started working on it, I don't know how interesting all this is, but I'll go back to when I was in college.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, just prior to starting college, I'd finished high school and decided to take a year off. And during that time, I worked at a local McDonald's, and pretty much was making not big bucks, but I was making a little bit of money, and that enabled me to be able to spend money on movies. And that was during the time that I really started to get heavily into Bava, and started buying the VHS dupes of like Japanese laser discs and things like that of a lot of Bava films, and then Argento and Fulci and so on. And during that time, I thought, why hasn't anybody written a book about Mario Bava? It just seemed like it was a natural that there should be at least one. Well, I had no idea at that time that there was somebody else who was working on a book, had been working on it for many years. I didn't know about that. It was Tim Lucas's book that he was working on, but I didn't know that at the time, so I kind of blithely set about writing my own. And I'm glad in hindsight I didn't know, because if I had known that, I probably wouldn't have done it. But I pretty much saw it initially as just going to be like maybe a magazine article or even a monograph. And it wasn't until I was in college that a professor of mine said, you've got the makings of a book here. And I found that kind of strange, because I didn't see myself as somebody who was going to be writing books, but I figured, okay, and with his help and feedback and guidance throughout college, I was working on that book, and it finally got published through FAB Press in England in 2002. And it did very well, and won a few awards. Not that I ever got them, but no. It did. The publisher got them. And I got a lot of good feedback on it. Not inevitably, not everybody liked it, but it seemed like for the most part, people did like it. And then I wanted to do a revised version for a long time, because over time I just realized I could probably do it a little bit better, and there were other things that I had discovered and wanted to sort of update it. And in 2012, the rights reverted back to me from FAB Press, and I took it to Midnight Marquee, and they put out a revised and expanded edition, which is funny to say that, because if you look at the 2 volumes side by side, the new version looks a hell of a lot thinner than the old one. But it is revised, and it has new content. But there were some things that had changed in the 10 years, basically, that decade in between. And one of them was the availability of the films. And so one of the big things was it was no longer necessary to have big, long plot synopsis of things in a book anymore, which I hate. If it were up to me, it would just be a line or two of plot synopsis. But FAB wanted more detail because at that time, those movies weren't as easy to see. So, yeah, there was a certain amount of cutting things out and pasting new things in and everything else, but that's the long and the short of it, I guess. That's how it ended up being done twice.
Now, I don't know if I'm familiar with the initial edition other than, knowing that it exists. Were there any films when you did the first edition that were just totally elusive at that point, just because they weren't on home video and you didn't know how to get access to it?
No, fortunately, I was able to see all the films that he directed. In the years since then, I was able to catch up with some things that he had a hand in without credit. But I was able to watch all of the major directorial films even back then. It did take a lot of digging around, and it's weird now. Here we are. If I think about it, it was about 20-some years ago that I really started working on the book in its first edition. So in that time, now we have all these Blu-ray editions and so forth. It's just kind of amazing to me that so many of these movies are available in very nice editions, whereas you used to have to go through the gray market route and get really kind of crappy VHS copies of them.
Right, and I know, like, even initial DVDs of some of the movies said scenes cut still. Is that still the case, or are they finally released virtually uncut?
With Bava, no, I don't think there are any issues with the editions being cut. There are a couple that could really do with better transfers. I know the Whip and the Body, for example, the version that's available on Blu-ray looks horrible. It's taken from a master that just I don't know why they even accepted it, but I'd love to see that redone. And there are a few of his that need to be released yet on Blu-ray. Most of them are available. I can't think of any off the top of my head that are cut. As a matter of fact, some of the ones that Arrow put out, for example, include both the original Italian version as well as like the AIP cuts. So you get something like The Girl Knew Too Much, which was heavily revised in the U.S. as Evil Eye, or The Three Faces of Fear, which again heavily revised by AIP for Black Sabbath. You get both of those cuts on the same disc.
Okay, but wasn't it true that a lot of the times, maybe this was back when it was on tape, it was just the AIP version, so you would not see the uncut Italian version at all. Yeah. Okay.
Oh yeah, that was kind of mind-blowing in itself when I first started digging around and trying to write about these films back in the day, because I really wasn't aware of a lot of the variant editions and things like that. So started to uncover that and track down the Italian versions. It was really, really interesting to compare them. The Italian versions inevitably were more adult in nature, whereas the AIP versions were typically geared towards kids.
Right. And I wasn't aware of that either. I didn't know how prevalent that was in horror movies. I thought, that's just an occasional thing Hammer does or something, and then I found out Amicus had cuts. Any studio had cuts when they got to America for whatever reason.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I remember seeing Commander USA's Groovy Movies. I don't know if you remember that show or not, but it was on the USA Network in the 80s, and he ran a few Hammer films, for example, and he ran like Vampire Circus and Countess Dracula, for example, and Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell, and they were heavily cut.
Oh, yeah.
And only recently, especially Vampire Circus, which is kind of a kinky movie.
Yes.
I think it's probably the sexiest movie they ever made, although it's pretty it gets away with some strange things. We'll just put it that way. It's kind of implicit bestiality and things like that in this film, and that was cut down to PG level when really in certain scenes it didn't make any sense at all.
Yeah, and I'm sure that was the way I originally saw it, and wasn't terribly impressed. The later Blu-ray actually go, oh, this is a different film.
Oh, yeah. Well, it makes all the difference.
Yeah.
And especially, too, when we talk about, like, Bava, it's very, very important to see good prints in the sense of appreciating the artistry and the color. The use of color in his films is so striking. If you watch a faded version of Blood and Black Lace, for example, it just doesn't play. But if you see it with the full Technicolor effect, it's just absolutely, an amazing experience.
Okay. Now, you did Bava first, was there ever a thought before you did that first book to just do, basically, I think it was your second book where you just kind of covered Italian films in general, horror films in general?
The Giallo film specifically. Well, after the Bava book, original version of the Bava book in 2002, I thought about doing a book on John Carpenter.
Yeah.
And I'm still thinking about doing that. It's just, one of these days I'll get around to it. Every now and again he sticks his head above ground and says he might make another movie. And so you think, well, maybe I should wait a while.
Yes.
He looks considerably older than what he is. It's not a very nice thing to say, but it's true. The years have not been kind to him. Hopefully he'll be around for another 30, 40 years, but realistically he is 70 now, so
right.
We'll see if he makes anything else. But I had thought about doing that, but they're really, at FAB, as grateful as I was to them for publishing my first book, and I am very grateful to them, they weren't terribly encouraging about other projects, and I just kind of, I lost an interest for a period of time, and I was doing a lot of reviewing online for different websites like Eccentric Cinema and DVD Maniacs, but the idea of doing another book didn't really come into focus until after I did the revised Bava book back in 2013, I guess. So after that, I enjoyed doing that so much, I thought about doing this book on Giallo films. I'd been thinking about that for a while. And that became so deadly, so perverse. For those who don't know what the Giallo is, it's just basically an Italian thriller, which is very stylized and often rather sleazy. They are sort of pulp movies that it's not as much about who done it as it is how they do it. There's a lot of emphasis on really colorful murder sequences and things like that in those films. There's a whole wide variety of different Giallo films. Some of them are pretty sleazy and down market. Some of them are actually extraordinarily good, but there's a lot of them. And the idea of sort of trying to put them all together and do an entire series, or I shouldn't say entire series, but an entire book devoted to the entire genre came to me. But that ended up becoming a three-part project because there were so many of them.
Okay. I got so many different questions. So let's go back to Mario Bava for a second. Did you ever get a chance to interview him or meet him in your years of working on the book?
Oh, no.
Yeah,
No.
I was asked, just in case. I know.
I was only 3 when he died, so that would have been awkward.
Okay, that's right. You are younger than me, but it's like people have weird encounters in their life, but 3.
Oh, it's true. No, I would have loved to. If anybody if I could have met him, it would have been fascinating because. Unlike a lot of directors, he was a very humble and modest man, and if anything, he tended to sort of self-sabotage himself in interviews. When people took him seriously, he would you can't picture most directors going into an interview and saying, my work's nothing but bullshit, but he did that. And, why they'd ask him, why did the Italians don't like your movies, but the Americans and the French do? Why is that? And they say, well, they don't know any better. So he was just like that, and he didn't take himself seriously. I would love to have met him, but no, unfortunately, the directors I've written about, in terms of my books, Fulci passed away, right around the time I was getting into his movies. I am working on a book on Dario Argento. I have not personally met him, but I do have a friend who was able to interview him for me, so I've got an interview with him in the book. So hopefully someday I'll get a chance to meet him at least.
Yes. Or his daughter, maybe.
Yeah.
Let's see. There was one other question I had about Mario Bava. Well, I'll come back to it. Okay, so the next book you have, you stayed with Midnight Marquee publisher after that, right? Because all your books kind of have a similar look. Is that correct?
Yeah, for the most part. I have done a couple of other projects with a company called WK Books.
Okay.
They put out a couple of different sort of fanzine type things, like Wang's Chop and a magazine called Monster. And I did a book on Klaus Kinski for them called Real Depravities.
Okay. And
a book on Paul Naschy, the Spanish horror king.
Oh, so those are a different publisher. Okay, well.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, the others were all Midnight Marquee, though.
I get it. Okay. We'll talk about those in a second, but going back to the Fulci book, because you'd mentioned that one. How do you feel? Well, I don't know how to ask this. I'll just ask it. It sounds like a dumb question. How does he compare to Bava? I mean, I've seen both films, and they are kind of different, but I wanted to get your take on it.
Well, I think we have to understand that when it comes to Italian horror, the three kings, as it were, are Mario Bava, Lucio Fulci, and Dario Argento. Yeah. And how people rate them varies wildly. I don't think any one of them is accepted as the sort of best of the best more than anybody else. I love all three. I do think Bava is the best of them all. He just had an extraordinary ability to make something out of nothing. Something that recurs throughout his films is the fact that he really only once or twice in his career as a director had decent budgets to work with. So a lot of what he did was really accomplished with smoke and mirrors. There's a lot of trickery in his films that's pretty much invisible because he was so damn good at it. Mm-hmm. Fulci was, like Bava, what you would call a journeyman director. That means that he pretty much did whatever was popular at a given time. No harm in that, but it's something that means that their filmographies are a little bit more sort of rambling and inconsistent in a way compared to somebody like Argento, who was able to specialize and pretty much write and direct his own films and establish himself as an auteur. Bava did have a strong hand in writing a lot of his films. Fulci was also a writer-director, but again, with Fulci, it was, whatever's popular. When musicals were popular, he did musicals. When comedies were popular, he did comedies. Westerns, he did westerns, and so forth. Fulci is a particularly interesting filmmaker for me in the sense that there's just such a strong, passionate quality in his films. And unexpectedly, too, I think a real strong kind of social conscience and a kind of a political theme that runs throughout some of his films to do with kind of attacking intolerance and the way that outsiders are often mistreated by society. It sounds like you're kind of, intellectual masturbation in a way when you start talking about it when you think of some of the films that he made, but it is there, and there's, again, this very strong, passionate kind of quality that's in his films that within a wide variety of different genres. And having watched all of his films that he directed, he did really, really good work in all those genres. He made a couple of really excellent westerns, for example. He did some really good comedies, just really good work in a wide variety of different styles, which I really appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Well, going back to like the socialist or the commentary, the political commentary, I find that kind of prevalent in a lot of Italian filmmakers. They don't have to be doing horror films. It's just anybody, even Fellini in a certain extent. It's like
exactly.
Even though his are a little different, but he always has some underlying commentary. It seems like every Italian movie has to have some sort of meaning to it. That's what I learned when I went to film class originally.
Well, there was a lot of that. I mean, there was a lot of turmoil and a lot of unrest in Italy, especially in the 60s, between the sort of student rebellions and things like that were going on. There was a strong interest in kind of communism and so forth. I mean, Fulci and Argento both kind of align themselves with that. Even though to an extent it's kind of like having Visconti, who called himself a communist, but at the same time he was a nobleman with all this property and all this money and everything else. So it's easy to claim to be something when you're living high on the hog.
Right.
But there was a lot of political, very, very strong political filmmaking, and inevitably most of it very left-leaning sort of cinema during that time. One of the reasons that Sergio Leone wasn't taken as seriously for a while as he should have been was that his films weren't particularly political.
That's true.
And when he finally decided to make a political film with a movie called Duck You Sucker, also known as Fistful of Dynamite, he didn't endear himself to them because he basically made a movie that said, don't get involved. So that wasn't what most people wanted to do. You know, you look at like the Damiano Damiani films or Francesco Rossi or Elio Petri and things like that. These movies are kind of, you know, the working man needs to, be politically involved and fight back against the machine and stand up for yourself and, you know, all that sort of thing. And here's Leone saying, you know, just keep your head down. It's better that way. So that was very, very strong. And obviously there's a lot of that in Fulci. Not so much in Bava. I don't think Bava was really particularly interested in political concerns.
That's true. My exposure, of course, to Italian films is probably like everybody else, the Clint Eastwood trilogy. You know, as far as, you know, and, you know, maybe silly things like Hercules films where they're dubbed and things like that. My first exposure to something that was political was something like Rome Open City, you know, and it's like the film instructor was saying, you know, pay attention to this and this symbolism and this and that. And the guy, I'm like, good grief, you know, there's like symbolism in every scene. How do you do a film like that?
Well, I think sometimes, you know, I think academia has its place, and I don't want to slam people who are into it, but I think it's easy sometimes to get a little carried away. I think sometimes some of these things were kind of just in the air in a sense. They were kind of accidental in a way. I think it's easy sometimes to get a little. I remember listening to a commentary on Paul Morrissey's film Blood for Dracula, which was made in Italy for Carlo Ponti, and it's a really wonderful kind of satire of horror films. But this commentator, who's rather dry, starts talking about, you know, the symbolism of the girls working in the fields. You know, it's a reference to bitter rice and to Nadir Rila. And I'm thinking, you know, maybe it is, but I don't know. We don't need to get there. We don't have to turn everything into a polemic. It's when I hear some of these people, the film theorists who get really off on their own fumes, so to speak, trying to read really, really strong kind of political and social commentary into some of the grubbier Italian genre films. I admit I kind of roll my eyes, but it's valid. It's just not entirely for me all the time.
Right. It's just kind of funny, you know, as an aside, you know, when I was in film school in college, they talked about the symbolism in everything, and it was enough that I was also doing film and television production, and I did a comedy sketch show, and I called it Random Acts of Meaningless Comedy, and I purposely called it that because, you know, there's no meaning behind anything I'm doing. Of course, looking back on it, whenever I've watched it, this is like 30 years ago, I go, wow, I was really kind of making my own, maybe Sergio Leone type statement, but it was, you know, kind of like that. And I didn't intend that. And it's like, so yes, you can find symbolism and meaning even in a Disney film if you were looking for it. Sure. So, you know, so. Sure.
It could be there. Sometimes it's deliberate. I do believe it's definitely there in some films. It's very overt in some films. Some films are just meant to be diversions. They're just meant to be entertainments. And it just always, it reminds me a little bit, sort of keeping with the Italian theme, that Roman Polanski made a film in Italy called What? And it was during that period of time. It was after the commercial failure of Macbeth, which was a fantastic film, but it didn't do well. And it was before he kind of came back into the critical pantheon with Chinatown, and he just wanted to make a completely pointless film, and so he did. I don't know if you've ever seen that film or not. I quite like it, but I understand why a lot of people don't. It is pointless.
I'm not sure if I've seen that one. I've seen a lot of Polanski films, but I may not.
It's a strange film. It's basically Alice in Wonderland on acid.
Okay, that's a good way to describe it.
American tourist who ends up in this villa in Italy with Marcello Mastroianni and a variety of other characters. And it's just you either like it and laugh at it, which I do, or it probably will just, you know, bore the hell out of you, one or the other. I think it's amusing, but that's an example of what, you know, a quote-unquote serious filmmaker can go and deliberately make a completely pointless, meaningless film. It's just, you know, it's meant to be amusing. You either find it amusing or you don't.
Okay. Let's see. Your two more recent books, you mentioned them, but I'll go one at a time. And so, Real Depravity's Klaus Kinski. What attracted you to write a book about him? I mean, he's a very diverse actor, very strange actor sometimes, but give me your take on him.
Well, I suppose I first became aware of Kinski as a child from For a Few Dollars More, where he plays the hunchback. Lee Van Cleef strikes the match on his neck, and I remembered him from that. I remembered seeing him as Renfield in Jess Franco's version of Dracula with Christopher Lee. I had seen the stills of him as Nosferatu, although I didn't see the film until years later. And I saw a film with him and Oliver Reed and Sterling Hayden called Venom on TV when I was a kid, which is a movie I'm extremely fond of that most people don't seem to like, and I don't know why. I think it's a really good movie, but I had, obviously written a couple of books on directors. I'd written a couple of books on sort of, genre in general, and I thought it might be interesting to tackle an actor. And I thought about the different actors that I like, and the world doesn't need another book on Boris Karloff at this point. There's been so many. And I love Boris Karloff. Don't get me wrong. If somebody could write a really interesting, fresh take on it, I'd love that. Same with Peter Cushing. If somebody wanted to write a good, objective biography that didn't cram the idea that the man was a saint down our throats, I'd love to read it, because he was a complicated human being. If you know much about Peter Cushing, he wasn't a saint. He had his flaws like the rest of us did, and I'd love to see a biography that honestly dealt with that. Christopher Lee is my favorite actor, but Jonathan Rigby wrote a book on him, which I couldn't touch that, so I'm not going to try to do that. And I was just sort of thinking about different people, and Kinski showed up in my mind, and I thought, there hasn't been a book in English that really just dealt with him as an actor. Everything that's out there kind of deals with him being a lunatic, which he was. He did, in fact, in the 50s, he ended up in a sanitarium in Germany for a period of time after, I believe, a suicide attempt, and he was diagnosed as being schizophrenic. So he had problems, and we've all heard the stories. We've all heard the stories about what an epic shit he could be and everything else, but there's also the fact that he was a great actor, and I wanted to do a book that said, let's just forget about all the crazy Klaus stories for a moment. We'll talk about them briefly, but let's talk about the guy's talent. And so that's why I wrote Real Depravity. So it was just basically to give a sense of a very diverse career. This was a man who likened himself to a whore. He said, I will do anything for money. If you pay me enough money, I'll do it. So I mentioned before the movie Venom. He did that movie sooner than do Raiders of the Lost Ark because they offered him more money. So there you go. Was it a good move or not? I don't know. But I actually really like Venom, so I'm okay with it.
Yeah. And to listeners out here, this is not the current film that's also called Venom. It's a completely different film.
No,
yes.
That's true. That's very true.
Let's see. My first exposure that I knowingly knew of Klaus Kinski, you mentioned, is Nosferatu. It was when it came out, and for me, I was like, I didn't know. I mean, I guess I did know there was a silent version, but I hadn't seen it at that time. My first exposure to Dracula was, of course, Bela Lugosi, so I like, what is this? So, and I had forgotten until you just said so that he was in For a Few Dollars More, so I was like, oh yeah, that's right, he's in that. But I don't think he got much notoriety until Nosferatu, is that correct?
Well, up until he started working with Herzog in 1972 on Aguirre, The Wrath of God, which is one of my all-time favorite movies, he was well known in the European film scene, especially in Germany and Italy and so forth. He was a name over there, but he hadn't quite made it as a name over in the U.S., for example, although he had been in some big films. He was in Dr. Zhivago, for example, a small part, but a very memorable part. He gets to share a scene on the train with Ralph Richardson and some other big names, he was constantly working. Like Christopher Lee, he was an actor who managed to make a ton of movies because his roles were typically rather small. So therefore, he wasn't wasting a lot of time on lengthy movie shoots. He typically would film for a week or two, and then he would go on to the next project, and that's how you rack up a lot of credits. Christopher Lee did that a lot. Donald Pleasance did that a lot. John Carradine did that a lot. So I think he really found his art house credibility with working with Werner Herzog, although their relationship was certainly very antagonistic, to say the least. But they brought out the best in each other.
Yeah, I was going to say something that brings out a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, they made, 5 films together, and obviously they both threatened to kill each other on more than one occasion. But, Herzog always said what matters is what's on the screen. It doesn't matter about the drama behind the scenes. It just matters what's on screen. And he knew Kinski was good. And obviously he was the perfect casting for Nosferatu, which was not a particularly big success commercially when it came out, although it was well reviewed. It didn't do as well as I think they were hoping. Right around that time, of course, you also had the Universal remake of Dracula with Frank Langella and Laurence Olivier. And then I think the one that did the best of all was Love at First Bite with George Hamilton.
Well, I saw all 3 in the theater when they came out. So yes, very,
I would have loved to have seen them in the theater.
Yeah.
I saw them on video, but I love all 3 in their own way. But yeah, Love at First Bite was the disco Dracula everybody wanted.
I think actually, I'm thinking about it, is probably Klaus's daughter Natasha made a bigger impact on U.S. audiences first with things like Tess and a couple other films. Is that correct?
Well, Dawson Natasha, Tess was a big deal. Of course, I mean,
and that's a Polanski film too, but yeah.
Yeah, that was after his unfortunate experiences, which we don't need to get into all of that.
Right.
But that was his first film after the big sex scandal, and despite it all, it was tremendously successful and was nominated for several Oscars. It's a beautiful film, and it proved that she was a very good actress. Also proves that really creepy-looking men like Klaus Kinski and indeed Dario Argento can produce really beautiful daughters.
Yes. And in fact, I didn't see Tess when it first came out, but it was probably Time Magazine. My dad subscribed forever. That talked about her, and I said, "Wow, she's very beautiful." And then, like I said, I saw Nosferatu, not knowing that her dad was anybody, and I go, "Ew."
Yeah.
This is kind of a creepy guy, and not in Nosferatu makeup, just. Period. It's like...
Yeah, well, they didn't. I mean, obviously they shaved his head and gave him the fangs and everything. But I mean, realistically, he was. But it's funny. I've talked to women who think that he was extraordinarily sexy, and I don't understand it.
Well, women don't always go on looks; they go on personalities.
There's got to be partly that, and he certainly his autobiography, which was originally called "All I Need Is Love," and then it was released in a cut version, ironically called Kinski Uncut. They cut it because he made so many sort of slanderous and libelous comments in it. They had to change names and everything else. He talks extensively. I mean, the book is sex obsessed. I mean, and even if we go on the assumption that most of it probably isn't true, Klaus certainly got around a good bit. So, he had that bad boy thing going, I guess, which appealed to a lot of women.
Yeah. Now, did you, in the making of that book, did you reach out to Natasha at all, or no? Was it important?
No.
It wasn't
I had decided early on. There's a variety of reasons for that. Obviously, there's been some horrible allegations made down through the years by Kinski's children with regards to him and his behavior and everything else. So, didn't really want to go down that road. I didn't really want to get into kind of character assassination or ruminating on something that I don't know if it's true or not. It could be true. It may not be true. Kinski liked to shock people and upset people, and sometimes he would say something like, I fucked my daughter. Yeah. Well, you don't just go around and say that to people, but did he say it just to upset people, or did he? I don't know. I really don't know. So didn't want to go down those roads. I thought, I'll just limit myself to the movies, so I didn't really need to. The only person I did reach out to was the actress Maria Rome, who unfortunately has since passed away. She wrote a foreword for the book, and she answered some questions for me, and she spoke very well with him. But she talked about his autobiography and said that he made an allegation in there that he and her and another actress had a threesome together, and she said that just wasn't true. She was upset about him saying that, but she decided later on, well, that's just Klaus, and I'm just going to have to accept it and move on with my life, which she did.
Yeah, it sounds like in you're writing, you tend to take the high road like I tend to do. I don't like to do what I call the warts and all. Unless it's critical to the story, there's no point in saying, that someone's a child molester or somebody who is a pedophile or whatever, or, robbed a bank even or anything like that, unless it's critical to saying, well, this stopped his career because of this, but even then, to go into excessive detail about it,
I think there's a difference. I mean, it depends. If you're writing a biography on something, what I was writing wasn't a biography. It was a sort of critical look at his work as an actor. Yeah. It was designed to be about the films. If I were writing a biography, that'd be different. That's where you do kind of want to wrestle with that a little bit, and sometimes that's when you're forced to acknowledge the fact that the people you admire, again, they have their flaws, and right. It's not necessarily a bad thing to mention it and to say, well, this happened and that happened. That's unfortunate, but I don't think it's really our place to sit there and sort of pass moral judgment. But if you're going to write a biography, something that's really geared towards being an honest biography, then you do kind of want to acknowledge the bad stuff along with the good. But in this case, I decided early on that it's just not really germane to the subject.
Probably for the best. So
yeah.
So the next book you have here, The Human Beast, Paul Naschy. I know the name, but familiarize me with him.
Well, Paul Naschy was basically the Spanish Lon Chaney.
Okay.
He was somebody who became obsessed with horror films as a child when he saw Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman when he was just a little boy. And basically that movie made a huge impression on him. And he's an interesting character in the sense that he was also an athlete, and he was a weightlifter. He's a champion weightlifter, and so you're dealing with this big, imposing, burly guy who is going into weightlifting competitions and things like that. But he's also interested in writing, so he wrote some sort of pulp novels under an alias, especially westerns and things like that, and gradually worked his way into making movies. And in the early 60s, there was that big boom in sort of international co-productions. A lot of Hollywood movies were shooting in Spain because they had great resources, and let's be honest, it was cheaper. So you had like King of Kings and all these sort of biblical movies going on being shot in Spain. And big, strapping guys like Paul Naschy were good to play background parts, and so that's how he got started. But unlike every single other actor who's become associated with horror films, many of them struggled with that mightily. Many of them weren't thrilled about it. But Paul Naschy actually actively sought to become known for doing horror films. He wrote his own films under his birth name of Jacinto Molina. He ended up becoming a producer, and he directed quite a few of them later on, too, under his birth name. But as an actor, he became known as Paul Naschy, and he was especially well known for playing a character he created called Waldemar Daniński, who was a Polish nobleman who gets bitten by the werewolf, and you know how that goes. So he did a whole series of movies playing Waldemar Daniński. He played Dracula, he played Jekyll and Hyde, he played the Mummy. He did, just about all of the major horror characters at one point or another, and just a very, very interesting guy, somebody who really had a tremendous love of the genre, and he's another one whose films were damaged for many years because we would get them over here typically on TV, and they'd be badly dubbed into English, cut and shown in bad prints. But here again, nowadays we can see a lot of them in better quality with the original Spanish soundtracks, and they come across that much better. Just a really rich body of work that he left behind, both as an actor but also as a writer and director.
So yeah, that was going to be my next question. I mean, is his stuff readily available now, or is there a big chunk still missing or on the home video market?
progress is being made within the last couple of years. Fortunately, there's been a big upswing, and I've been fortunate enough to have been asked to participate in some of them, doing commentaries and so forth. Mondo Macabro has put out a couple of his films that he starred in and directed. He did a sort of witchfinder general type thing called Inquisition, which deals with the French rather than the Spanish Inquisition. That movie's available, and a movie called The Devil Incarnate, which basically is dealing with the idea of the devil taking human form and coming up to cause some mischief, only to discover that man is a lot worse than he is. And I did the commentary for that release, which I think is a truly great film. Shout Factory's put out a couple of box sets of his movies. There's some more coming from Scorpion. So, yeah, a good chunk of his stuff is available. There's still a good chunk left to go, though, and hopefully somebody at some point will start putting them out.
And again, the same question I asked about the other ones. I mean, the films that aren't really readily available, have you had access to them, or are there things you have not seen?
With regards to Naschy, well, I'll say the same thing about Kinski. With Kinski, there were actually a couple of things that I wasn't able to see because they don't appear to exist anymore, unfortunately. But Naschy-wise, yes, I was able to get a hold of pretty much everything. The exception would be some sort of Spanish TV things that he did and a few sort of short subject things that just I was unable to find. But fortunately, I was able to get all the feature films, and I'm happy to say that at this point, with the exception of maybe one or two films, all of the films are available through the gray market circuit at the very least with English subtitles. So the subtitles may sometimes be a little wonky, but it's enough to give you an idea of what's going on.
Right. And I think you might have said, but I mean, how did you come across him? Was it, again, the late night movie shows and things like that, or?
Yeah, funnily enough, again, Commander USA and USA also had in the 80s a thing called Saturday Nightmares, and they used to run a bunch of especially Spanish imports that were from imported to the U.S. by a company called Independent International, and they were kind of the bottom of the barrel equivalent to American International. I mean, American International had Vincent Price and Basil Rathbone and people like that. Independent International had Lon Chaney Jr. when he was about ready to die, and they made the like Al Adamson movies, just the really worst of the worst movies. But they imported a bunch of really good Spanish horror films, and that included some Paul Naschy things like Night of the Howling Beast, which is one of his Waldemar Daninsky movies, and I remember seeing those on TV as a kid. Again, didn't really understand the notion of them being foreign movies, and certainly didn't know who the hell he was. But then later on in the 80s, I became better aware thanks to resources like Fangoria and a great book that I just absolutely devoured as a kid called The Encyclopedia of Horror Films, which really, was a big eye-opener for me.
How do they compare, now that you're talking about it, I may have seen them, but not knowingly, but how do you feel the Spanish films compare to the Italian films?
There are similarities, but they're also different. The Spanish films tend to be a little bit rougher around the edges. They tend, unfortunately, sometimes to have more overt misogyny in them. It was a peculiar thing that during the reign of Francisco Franco, don't forget Generalissimo Franco is still dead.
Yes.
He was very much opposed to love scenes in films, but he didn't seem to have a problem with rape scenes. And so you get things like the Blind Dead movies, which you may have heard of, where there's, in almost all of them, there's the inevitable rape scene where the woman ends up enjoying what's going on. The scenes like that are problematic nowadays, to say the least.
This was Naschy having problems with it, or?
Oh, no, that was Francisco
Franco. Okay, I just want to clear this up.
That was Naschy,
okay.
no.
Okay,
Naschy,
okay.
Once the censorship changed after Franco died, that kind of thing changed. But during that early part of the 70s, when Franco was still in charge, they weren't allowed to do certain things. And for whatever strange reason, they weren't keen on the idea of love scenes. But, scenes of sexual abuse, that was okay.
Wow.
Yeah, kind of a strange way of thinking, but it probably sort of ties into the sort of misogyny and whatnot that was typical in Spanish culture during that time. They're similar in the sense that they are also very heavy on atmosphere and sometimes a little bit weak on narrative, but I'd say a little bit rougher around the edges than the Italian films. And oddly enough, although Spanish's language is closer to English than Italian is, the quality of the Spanish dubs weren't as good, or I should say the English dubs on Spanish films weren't as good as the quality on the Italian dubs, which I guess was just down to the availability of the vocal talent and so forth that were employed. The people that were working out of Rome were just better, I suppose, than the ones that were stationed in Spain.
Mm-hmm. Now, were there any other prominent people in Spain besides Naschy that you may or may not have covered at this point? I mean, but that you can alert us to?
Well, no, there's no. He's the only one that I've dealt with in terms of Spanish horror,
Okay.
and I mean, certainly there were other filmmakers who were instrumental in kind of creating a Spanish horror film. That was one of the things too about Naschy. Basically, before people like Naschy and another director named Armando de Osorio, who did the Tombs of the Blind Dead movies, before they started dabbling in horror films, there really weren't Spanish horror films because, again, Francisco Franco didn't like them. They weren't encouraged to be made. So the Hammer movies and things like that were imported sometimes, and they did well, but nobody wanted to take a chance on making them, and it was De Osorio and Naschy who decided they were going to take a chance on making some, and they were commercially successful. One of the things they had to be mindful of, though, was the censorship, and so one of the things that they had to make do with was the fact that Francisco Franco would turn a blind eye to the idea of horror films being made in Spain, but they must never, ever be set in Spain. So the Waldemar Daninsky character, for example, is a Polish nobleman because Franco would not have it that it would be a Spaniard. It was just, no way. So the Spanish films are typically set in Germany, in France, in England, in Scotland, wherever, anywhere but Spain.
Interesting. Yeah, it's like the only exposure I've heard of Franco in regards to film was when I did interviews in regards to Patty Freeling. Some of their films were outsourced to, it's called Peg Bar Productions, but they said, they'd have to run them past Franco, but they're cartoons, they're made for kids. Generally, they passed without issue, so they were generally left alone. So, but this is the first I've heard of any overt censorship, in regards to like horror films or anything like that,
Oh yeah, well, it was a big thing. Even Bava made a film in Spain called Hatch of Her Honeymoon, and it was an Italian-Spanish co-production. But the location, the big location of the fashion house that you see in the film, was actually Francisco Franco's villa. And Bava told a story about, I think they asked him why was there so little blood in that movie, and he said, well, we were shooting in Franco's villa, and if we got blood on the carpets, we probably would have been shot. So they had to be careful of that sort of thing. After Franco died, Naschy and other filmmakers too, but Naschy made some films that absolutely would have gotten him put in jail, maybe even executed, if they had been made during Franco's reign. He made a film called The Sniper, for example, which is all about a plot to kill Francisco Franco. He made a movie called The Transsexual, which dealt with the kind of gay scene in Spain and the kind of, transsexual community. I mean, these are things that no way in hell, if they'd been made a couple years before, would they ever seen the light of day. And chances are he would have been put in jail for them.
Wow. Now, was there a requirement by Franco or anyone else that they had to shoot these films, or you said not set them, but shoot them in Spain, or were they free to go abroad or anything with anything?
Well, they would shoot. Typically, they were shot largely in Spain. Interiors would have been done in sound stages and so forth, but usually to sell the illusion that they were set in England, for example, they would go over for a week and go around Soho or something like that. So they have something like Dr. Jekyll and the Werewolf, where you have Paul Naschy done up as Mr. Hyde in his opera cape and top hat walking down the streets of Soho, which is just delightfully surreal and strange. But that sort of thing they would do. But very often it was more a matter of just, it would be sometimes really obvious that it's Spain, but everybody's talking about it like we're out here in Heidelberg or whatever. So it's it's like they knew what they were doing, but at the same time they were appeasing Franco by doing things like that.
Right. Okay. I was just curious, how strict they were in other ways. It sounds like they did have a little freedom to move about, but
a little bit. I mean, they had to be careful too with sex because, like I said before, they had some rather strange opinions about that. But they were very anything that was erotic, they would shoot in 2 takes. So the Nashi films exist usually in 2 different versions. There's a version where the girl's wearing a nightgown, and there's a version where she's naked. Take your pick. Which one you want to watch? Nowadays you can pick, but the export versions were typically, would be shown in England and America. Some of these movies did play in American theaters. Some of them went straight to TV. Avco put a package of them together in the 70s, for example. They had a bunch of Nashi movies that went straight to TV. But yeah, they would do 2 different versions because in the Spanish market they would not accept any kind of nudity whatsoever.
Interesting that they would allow them to shoot the nudity for export version. I guess they didn't mind.
Yeah, well, the British did the same thing to a certain extent in the 50s, late 50s, when Hammer was in full swing. Sometimes they would do stronger takes for the export. They would say it was the Japanese version or whatever, but in fact, there was some truth to that. There were some scenes. Apparently, there were takes in The Mummy with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, where during the Egyptian flashback sequence, the handmaidens were shown bare-breasted in a alternate take. But I've never seen such footage, but apparently it was shot that way. At least that's the story.
But it is interesting you're saying that it's like in both cases the milder version is the version that's home-based, and then for export it's always Yeah, but of course, I guess the milder version would have ended up in Spain had they shown it there. I'm sure the Mummy or something like that.
Oh yeah, well absolutely.
Yes.
They were pretty prudish when it came to that aspect.
My first exposure to anything being different like that was probably on Monty Python, where they do the skit about the man with 3 buttocks. And they said, "Didn't we just do this skit?" And he goes, "Well, I thought this was the continental version."
Yes.
And I said, "What does that mean?" And then I figured it out. I did a little research. I got, they do, British versions and then ones for the European continent. Oh, I get it. Okay. So it was a little, mention of that. At this point, you've done all these. Did I cover all the books that you've done to date?
The only other ones that I can think of that we didn't touch on, I'm working with another writer named Chris Workman. We've done a couple of volumes in our own sort of encyclopedia of horror film series called The Tome of Terror. That's also through Midnight Marquee. We have 2 volumes out so far. One covers 1895 to 1929. The second volume covers the 30s, and we have, hopefully next year, fingers crossed, the 1940s volume will come out.
Are you just taking that series decade by decade after this, or is it even going to be like you'll have to do half a decade because of how many horror films are made?
Well, it depends on the decade, certainly. I think the 40s and 50s will be okay, but when we get to the 60s and 70s, it'll almost have to be split into 2 volumes at least, I would think, because, my God, there's so many of them. I almost don't even want to think about that because it's going to be a lot of dreck I'm going to have to sit through, but we'll get there eventually. But yes, it's supposed to be decade by decade.
And going back to the first volume, so you said 1895 to 1929, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. And you better believe there's a lot of movies in there that we could not watch.
Yes, that was my question. I was going to say, I know things like London After Midnight, I always think of that, but, do you, just because of, press releases or other scripts or whatever, do you think you've gotten the majority of what probably existed, or do you think that there's totally tons of horror-based films from that period that just there's no record of at this point?
I think we have rounded up as much as anybody ever has. I am always a little bit resistant to that word definitive because I don't want to be thinking of myself as the last word on anything.
Right.
I think that we put together as much as anybody ever has. We'll just put it that way. Possibly there's material that will turn up years from now that'll say, oh, there was this obscure movie in Bulgaria that dealt with werewolves. So, you know what? We didn't know about that, so sue me. There's so much I can say. There's a ton of movies, unfortunately, from that period of time that nobody's ever going to get a chance to see. But, you know, every now and again you hear about something weird, like they uncovered a bunch of old Doctor Who episodes, for example, in somebody's, you know, basement or whatever. So you never know. Maybe someday we will get a chance to see some of these films, although everybody who did see London After Midnight seems to be in agreement that it wasn't all that good. I'd love to see it anyway. The big movie that's lost that I'd love to see was actually a version of Jekyll and Hyde by F.W. Murnau called Der Januskopf, which starred Conrad Veidt and Bela Lugosi. I'd love to see that.
I think I've heard of that. I didn't know that was a missing one, but, you know, wow, you know, yeah, that sounds interesting based on just those two actors alone. So, yeah, during the course of doing that book, did anything come available that you could actually view at that point? I was always curious about, you know.
I mean, I suppose I know I ended up seeing a bunch of films I hadn't seen before.
Yeah.
Probably, frankly, I hadn't gone out of my way to try and track them down.
Yeah.
For many years, I have to admit, silent cinema wasn't my kind of go-to because I had a hard time with it. But over time, I've become very fond of it, and I'm a big fan of them now. But I remember seeing, I think the very first silent movie I ever saw was The Phantom of the Opera with Lon Chaney. And I was so excited to find a copy of it on video one time, and I asked my mom to buy it for me, and she said, it's a silent movie. I didn't know what she meant by that. So I got it home, and I turned it on, and people were moving their mouths and nothing's coming out. You know, what's that all about? It was off-putting for me for a while, but I came to like them. I like them very much now. I mean, certainly, you know, Murnau and Fritz Lang and people like that during that time frame were doing incredibly innovative work, and the introduction of sound in some respects was a big step backwards for a lot of filmmakers because it really encumbered them. You look at some of the things that Murnau was doing, for example, with the moving camera and things like that. Oh my God, they were way ahead of the curve.
Right, and I was learning in recent times, thanks to the Criterion Chaplin and Harold Lloyd films. There's a documentary on one of them, I don't know which one, but they're talking about how Chaplin and Lloyd were both frustrated when sound came in because they couldn't change the film speed anymore to make something funnier. They had to be totally a slave to the dialogue and had to shoot everything in real time, and it's like, you know, I don't know, was there a problem with that, to your knowledge, with horror films? It seems like everything was shot in real time pretty much.
Well, as far as film speed, no, I don't think. I mean, for years, a lot of the silent films were shown at the wrong speed, which gave them a jerkiness that wasn't intended.
Yeah.
When I first saw Murnau's Nosferatu, it was like that. And nowadays, you can watch a really gorgeous version available on Blu-ray, which has the right speed and with the appropriate tinting and everything. And it just plays so much better that way. In the early 30s, I know a film like Todd Browning's Dracula with Bela Lugosi. Arguably, that suffered a little bit from that kind of initial unease with using sound and music and so forth, and it comes across as a little bit stagey, whereas James Whale during that time with Frankenstein and The Old Dark House and so forth was really again, way ahead of the curve and doing a lot of interesting things with camera and with sound. Even though Frankenstein and The Old Dark House aren't scored films, they don't have music playing over their exciting scenes and things like that.
Right. His
use of sound was very good, so you don't really miss the soundtrack, the music in those cases.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess that's about everything to talk about. Is there anything? I mean, are there any books you mentioned John Carpenter, but are there any other people you'd like to write a book about or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, Carpenter's going to happen one day. I feel sure it's going to happen one day. I'm a big fan of his. I have been ever since I was a child. He was one of the first directors I was ever aware of, largely because his name's always above the title, so obviously that's a big giveaway. But I was aware of him and Hitchcock from, a very early age. That will happen one day. There are other people that I toy with the idea with every now and again, but I'm not really particularly settled on anybody else right now.
But it does sound like, from what we talked about, you tend to like to pick, as do I, a subject or a person that hasn't been covered to death. So it wouldn't be a Karloff book, say, coming out from you anytime soon,
No. I mean, as much as I love Hammer, we talked about Hammer briefly. I mean, I don't want to say that the world doesn't need any more Hammer books, because, anybody who wants to put the effort to it, if they can write something fresh and interesting, then that's good. I have seen so many books on Hammer, and so many of them aren't very good, but the ones that are good are very, very good, especially some of the books that have come out of the UK that are really, really exceptionally well-researched and well-written. I don't think I can add anything to that, so I don't think I'll be doing anything on Hammer anytime soon, but there are certain topics. Karloff and Lugosi obviously are actors who've been, so many books have been written. Lugosi has actually been written about very, very well, and every facet, I swear, every facet of the man's life and career has been covered. Karloff, not as much. Most of the Karloff books have been very, along the lines of what I was saying before about the Peter Cushing books. They've been sort of hero-worshipping type books, which is fine up to a point. But I can't help but wonder if there's a more interesting story in there that hasn't been told.
I have to ask Sarah, I suppose.
Yes. Well, there you go.
And then a couple other people you mentioned over the course of the interview is like Dario Argento planning there, do you think?
Yes, I'm working on that right now. Okay. As a matter of fact, I just sort of settled on what I'm going to call it. It's going to be called Murder by Design, the Unsane Cinema of Dario Argento. I have to give a shout-out to Vincent Pereira for suggesting the use of the Unsane Cinema of Dario Argento, because the American version of his movie Tenebrae was released over here as Unsane. It just seemed to make sense. It fits together nicely. So I'm working on that now, and that will not be out, I was going to say this year. This year's almost done. That would be impossible. I'm hoping it will be out in 2020.
Okay. And I do hope you at least get some contact with him, if not a full interview. And I know you said you got one some other way, but,
Oh, yeah. We have an interview with him. We have an interview with one of his daughters. We have a bunch of interviews for the book, which is really good. I'd love to meet him someday, though, in person.
Yeah, that's what I kind of meant. Yeah. And, you mentioned Werner Herzog. Do you think that would be a subject of a book in the future, or...?
Werner Herzog. Well, that would be interesting. I think, if I met him, I would probably just be hypnotized by listening to him talk, because he has the most wonderful voice, and that would be interesting. I don't know if I could handle being on the phone talking with Werner Herzog, but I'd love to try it someday.
All right. Well, very good. Anything else you'd like to plug, a website or anything else before we go?
No, don't have any websites. In addition to the books, do a lot of audio commentary work. So, anybody who feels interested can always seek out some of the things that I've done in that capacity too. Okay.
And is this the best place to get your books on Amazon or Midnight Marquee, or both, or what's the best way?
Either of those ways is fine. Amazon is good. I probably end up getting a little bit more money if people order from Midnight Marquee, so go with them instead.
All right, sounds good. Okay, well, it was a pleasure speaking with you today. I learned a lot. It's like I knew about these types of films, but always interested in learning more about horror movies. And I want to thank you for being on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Okay, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you again for listening. Thank you again, Joy Howarth, for being my special guest. Episode number 18 will be coming soon. If you would like to comment and or be a guest on this podcast, please drop me a line at funideas.mark@gmail.com. Become a Patreon of Fun Ideas Productions. If everyone listening just contributed $1 a month, that would be a tremendous help. This has been the Fun Ideas Podcast. This is Mark Arnold speaking. This episode is copyright 2019 Fun Ideas Productions. Thank you very much, and have a good night.